in the war of 1971, when East Pakistan, as it then was broken off in a war between India and Pakistan to form what is now Bangladesh. And the Pakistanis certainly wanted revenge. They wanted, and said they wanted openly, they said they wanted to get revenge by breaking off a piece of India, just as India had broken off a piece of Pakistan. And that piece was to be Khalistan. But Pakistan wanted to support this campaign for Khalistan in the first place, was to bleed India, to cause India pain, to give India grief.
Right.
That they have achieved. They have achieved that. But they have done nothing to create an independent state. Where exactly would Khalistani militants go if they are planning terrorist attacks, if they are planning to attack Indian targets, if they have weapons, if they plan to do more than politics? Where are they going to be safe in India? Well, they're not. They depend on Pakistani support for carrying out the Khalistani project. And that if they make claims on Pakistan, they're going to get nowhere. And the support is going to dry up in a hurry. The most militant Sikhs, most militant Khalistani Sikhs, have been very good at Canadian politics.
Okay.
They will go to the politician and say, look, we are an important voting bloc. You know, we can bring in 2 busloads of voters to the nomination meeting in your riding and in your constituency, and you may lose the nomination without our support.
Folks, thank you very much for joining today's program on The Khalsa Today in my program called My Take with Sukhi Chahal from San Jose, California. I have a very important guest today. His name is Mr. Terry Milewski, and he's based in Ottawa. Mr. Terry Milewski is a retired senior journalist for CBC. Mr. Terry has wrote an absolutely fantastic report on Khalistan, the project of Pakistan, which is published by Ottawa-based think tank called Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Mr. Terry, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I think I'm going to enjoy this.
Thank you. Mr. Terry, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, actually? So then, do you have, this is the first time you wrote this report, or do you have past experience? Have you ever been to India?
Yes, in fact, I really began my journal. I was a journalist for 40 years. As you mentioned, I retired as a senior correspondent for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where I worked for about 40 years. And I worked in about 52 countries during that time. But my first big enterprise was going to India in 1967 as a very young man, where I interviewed Indira Gandhi. And anyway, I became fascinated, as many visitors do, with India, and I've been back many times since, both professionally and looking around personally. And during my time at the CBC, I covered pretty much anything that's news, sports, weather, disasters, famines, wars, of course. There was quite a few of those. I was in the Middle East for a while. I was in Central America for a while during the Reagan years. And I ended up in Ottawa, sort of home base, covering the last couple of Canadian governments. But one thing that sticks out, of course, is that in 1985, I was called on a Sunday morning at the end of June to go to Ireland because a plane had vanished from radar over the Irish coast. And it turned out that was the Air India bombing of June 23rd, 1985, in which 329 passengers and crew, mainly Canadians, but mostly of Indian descent, were all murdered. And it turned out, of course, that they were pawns in a battle for independence by Sikh groups fighting for an independent Khalistan. And so that began my interest in the story, which brings us here today, because I wrote an article about it, the latest of many articles I've written on the subject.
Very good. Mr. Terry, what inspired you to do the research story on Khalistan, especially the story which you just published?
Mainly because of that first experience of going to Ireland and having to, as a young reporter, and having to deal with questions such as, why would somebody do this? What kind of people would plant a bomb on a civilian airliner and murder people they didn't even know? Remember that back in 1985, this kind of mass terrorism, mass murder of innocent civilians was little known, much less known. The authorities, although they suspected the people who were involved in this bombing, they did not contemplate that such a thing would happen. They imagined hijackings, but they didn't imagine that somebody would go so far as to plant bombs, not just on one plane, but on two. The original plan was to put two bombs on two planes flying in different directions around the globe so that they would go off at opposite sides of the globe and create a spectacular terrorist attack, which would bring the attention of the world to the cause of Khalistan. That started me off asking that question: who would do this? Why would they do this? Witnessing the grief of the families, coming for the remains of their loved ones, and many of them not finding ever the remains of their loved ones, wandering the coast in some cases of Ireland, wondering if their loved ones had perhaps somehow by a miracle survived the fall from 38,000 feet. That never left me. That question never left me. And as the years went on, and I happened to be based in Vancouver on the west coast of Canada, when the trial was very belatedly begun in the British Columbia Supreme Court of a couple of the suspects. Then I happened to be in Ottawa when a long judicial inquiry began into what went wrong with the official. Why was the trial so long delayed, and why was it so fruitless? In the end, it turned out that I had my hard drive full of documents, evidence, transcripts of testimony, photographs, just a volume of evidence which tells a very sad story.
So what were your sources to arrive at the conclusion that the separatist movement of Khalistan in India had the backing of Pakistan?
It was really, it began with the historical background. That as I looked into this, it increasingly seemed that as I looked, for example, at the names of prominent Sikh militants, both from Canada and from other countries, notably the UK, also Germany, some in the United States, that many of them had a record of being present in Pakistan. Not necessarily, we didn't necessarily what they were doing in Pakistan, but they were there and moved freely, even though in some cases they were wanted for terrorist crimes. The prominent example being that of Talvinder Singh Parmar, the mastermind, as we now know, of the Air India bombing, who was given safe haven in Pakistan after he fled Canada. Why was that? The question arose, why was this? And when I began to look into this, of course, it all goes, we don't have long enough to discuss the aftermath of partition in 1947, but suffice to say that it began there, and more specifically in the war of 1971, when East Pakistan, as it then was broken off in a war between India and Pakistan to form what is now Bangladesh. And the Pakistanis certainly wanted revenge. They wanted, and said they wanted openly, well, covertly at first, but then openly, they said they wanted to get revenge by breaking off a piece of India, just as India had broken off a piece of Pakistan. And that piece was to be Khalistan. So that was really the origins of the idea of Khalistan. Seemed to, when the more you go into history, to have as much to, I won't say more than, but it had as much to do with Pakistani wishes as it did with Sikh wishes.
Okay.
And then as we looked further, of course, we all began to realize that this idea was not very popular among the Sikhs in Punjab. We in the West are used to hearing the calls for an independent state of Khalistan very loudly and very often, so often that we begin to think, well, that's normal. That's what the Sikhs want in general. The mass of Sikhs around the world want an independent state. Then I came to look at the election results, just as an example, and most recently in Punjab, where 90% of the world's Sikhs still live. And the splinter group of the Shiromani Akali Dal party, Amritsar splinter group, was the only party in the most recent election in Punjab to have a separatist platform, and they obtained. I'll be careful with this number because it's kind of strange. 0.32% of the vote. That is 1/3 of 1% of the vote. So obviously there is a story there, and the closer you look, the more the hand of Pakistan looms clear.
Okay. So we are talking about I think we are talking about the Shiromani Akali Dal, the Man group, right? Over here.
Correct.
Okay. So my next question, Terry. So did you talk to the protagonistic of this so-called movement of Khalistan? Who did you talk to? And if yes, then who were they in Canada?
Well, I talked over the years. I've talked to many people who believe and still believe in Khalistan. Although the closer you look, again, the more you find, first, the hand of Khalistan, and second, that the idea of Khalistan, although it's an important idea for many Sikhs, it seems to be unformed, ill-defined. For example, some years ago, there's as you know, there's a very large Sikh community here in Canada. It's perhaps the largest Sikh diaspora community in the world outside of India, with about 500,000 Sikhs. And they published a map of the proposed Khalistan, which is very ambitious on the Indian side of the border. That is to say, it doesn't just include Punjab, it includes pieces of several states, and it extends even as far as to include New Delhi, as part of Khalistan. But if you look to the west of the border, it does not include any of the traditional Sikh lands in what is now Pakistani Punjab.
Right.
So it does not include Lahore, for example, where Ranjit Singh had a Sikh empire 200 years ago. It does not include Nankana Sahib, the birthplace of Guru Nanak, the first Sikh guru. I mean, these are places which, needless to say, are at the heart of Sikh history and culture. And yet, none of that is included. Delhi is included in the map of Khalistan. And this is put out by Sikhs for Justice and the Man group of Shiromani Akali Dal, which you just mentioned. And so their idea of Pakistan seems to be limited, but we better not claim an inch of Pakistani territory. And so you ask yourself the question, why is that? Because it's very odd on the face of it. Why is that? And it's because they know that they depend on Pakistani support for carrying out the Khalistani project. And that if they make claims on Pakistan, they're going to get nowhere. And the support is going to dry up in a hurry.
Right. So my next question, what is the basis of your conclusion that Pakistan is the main player behind the scene of the Khalistan movement? And also, when we are talking about the Pakistan, are we talking about the deep state of Pakistan or the Pakistan public or Pakistan army or the ISI?
Well, I think the latter mainly. One of the episodes which I recount in the article that you described, in this most recent article, is the report of the death of Talwinder Singh Parmar, the Air India bomber that I mentioned earlier. It turns out that he had fled to Pakistan. He was on some sort of mission. We don't know exactly what his purpose was in Punjab, not far from his mother's place, and in a little village called Kang Arayan. He was spotted by the police, by the Punjab police, in two Maruti cars, 6 men. 2 of them turned out to be Pakistani agents. One was a Pakistani ISI man who was well known to be providing weapons, medical care, logistical support, training to Khalistani militants inside Pakistan. And the other was actually an Indian national using false Pakistani identity card and passport. They both had Pakistani passports. So it's very interesting that this was Parmar's last stand as the leader of his wing of the Baba Khalsa terrorist group. And that even in death, he had 2 Pakistanis with him. They were his important allies. And it appears to me now, looking at all of the evidence, that if you take away the Pakistani support, what's left is because if what you have left is the 0.32% of the vote that was gained by the only party running with a separatist platform in the last Punjab election, then you have nothing. You have no serious support for the idea of Khalistan among Sikhs where they live in Indian Punjab.
Very good. So my next question, what do you think the reason of some terrorists and the extremists aligning with the Pakistan in this campaign? What could be the reason?
What would be the reason why extremists align
with the Pakistan?
It's a very hard question. It's a good question, but it's a very hard question because the interests of Pakistan and the interests of the Sikhs, of Khalistani Sikhs, don't seem to meet very clearly. Pakistan wants, first of all, revenge, as we described earlier, against India for the 71 war and the breakaway of Bangladesh. Second, they want a buffer between India and Pakistan, a strategic buffer, and they hoped also to cut off India's land access to Kashmir. Also very important to the Pakistani leadership. Now, none of these are important to Sikhs living in Punjab. They would be on this side of the Indian side of the buffer. They wouldn't be protected on the Pakistani side of the buffer. So what are they getting out of it? What are they getting out of the deal? Answer, survival. Because without, as I said before, without Pakistan, they're going nowhere. Indeed, they're going nowhere, as it turns out, without Pakistan. Because what's happened is that the principal reason that Pakistan wanted to support this campaign for Khalistan in the first place was to bleed India, to cause India pain, to give India grief. That they have achieved. They have achieved that, but they have done nothing to create an independent state. So my answer to your question, why do extremists form this alliance, I think is that they have no choice because nobody else will align with them, not even the Sikhs they pretend to speak for.
Awesome. Very good, actually. Next question, why are you convinced that the separatist movement of Khalistan is funded by the Pakistan?
Well, I don't think that it's completely funded. I don't say in my article that it is entirely funded by Pakistan. On the contrary, I think that the separatists are very good at raising money themselves. They've shown they can do it, and that it's more in the realm of providing safe haven, providing places, safe houses, logistical support in the form of, for example, of the two Pakistani ISI agents who were found dead after the shootout in which Talwinder Parmar was killed near the lentil fields of Kang Arayan in 1992. I think that the Khalistanis have done very well at raising their own money. They have their own cause. I don't mean that that the cause is entirely created and funded by the Pakistanis, but where exactly would Khalistani militants go if they are planning terrorist attacks, if they are planning to attack Indian targets, if they have weapons, if they plan to do more than politics? Where are they going to be safe in India? Well, they're not.
So, in your opinion, what are the reasons of the government of Canada to turn the blind eye to this kind of terrorist activities?
Well, you ask a lot of hard questions. Politics is the easy answer to that hard question. The Canada, of course, like India, only on a smaller scale, has many different moving parts. In the first place, in terms of preventing, for example, the Air India bombing, they were just ignorant, blind. They didn't know anything about this conflict. All they knew was there were all the Sikhs in Canada. They were unhappy with the Indian government. There was a terrible business in 1984, the assassination of Indira Gandhi, the riots and the terrible massacres that followed. And that was about as much as the Canadian authorities. It wasn't their problem. It was a foreign problem. And so that's why, even though the Indians warned the Canadians to watch the extremists that they had identified, including Parmar, that's why Canada actually wiretapped the Air India bomber, Parmar, for months before the bombing. It's incredible to consider that they had a wiretap on his phone, but they didn't translate the calls. They had the tapes. They didn't translate. They had a shortage of Punjabi translators. The Canadian Security Service was new, badly trained, didn't know much about what this was all about. So that I would not call turning a blind eye, as though they didn't care. They just didn't understand, which is not quite the same thing. Then, after the bombing, when they did know what was going on, there was no excuse then. Once it became obvious that there were people bent who would not shrink from mass murder, then they simply did a poor job of investigation. There was a conflict between police forces. The security service wouldn't share the tapes with the police because they were only collecting intelligence. It wasn't meant to be criminal evidence. It would be wrong to give the tapes to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It sounds crazy to say this now, but that's what happened. So there was a poor job of investigation. But more recently, and I think this may be what you're getting at with your question, politicians have made a mistake in believing that the most militant Khalistani guys speak for the Sikh community and for Sikh voters generally. They think that if the guy says, well, I speak for the Sikhs, I have the biggest beard, I have the tallest beehive turban, they think, they believe it. And the most militant Sikhs, most militant Khalistani Sikhs, have been very good at Canadian politics. They will go to the politician and say, look, we are an important voting bloc. We can bring in 2 busloads of voters to the nomination meeting in your riding and in your constituency, and you may lose the nomination without our support. So you better be careful. And so it's worked. And even to this day, to some degree, it still works. But if you'll allow me, I'll add one extra paragraph to that. And that is that it only works so far. won't go much further. Consider that, for example, Ujjal Assange, of who you probably heard, he's the former Premier of British Columbia, he's a former federal cabinet minister. He's the most successful Sikh Canadian politician of his generation. He was elected and re-elected for 20 years in constituencies with heavily Sikh populations. So that tells me that Sikh voters don't necessarily follow the lead of the people who say they speak for the Sikhs. Apparently, they don't really speak for the Sikhs. So you see my point, that the Canadian politicians find an easy route. In some ridings, I would say half a dozen ridings, maybe. We call them ridings in Canada. It's an antique term for a political constituency. And some take the easy route, and it may work for a while, but not for long. But if you don't, if you openly say no to the Khalistanis, it turns out that you can get elected and you can succeed in politics.
Right. So let me ask you this question, the follow-up question. Do you, in your conviction, think the government of Canada was complicit in this one?
No, I do not think the government of Canada was do you mean complicit?
Yes.
No, I do not think so. I think that's a fantasy. I will grant you that if you look at the circumstances with a jaundiced eye, if you look at the circumstances where they knew that this man was a terrorist who was plotting a bombing, we speak of the Air India most obvious example. They knew India identified him as a terrorist. They tried to extradite him for murder. He was already wanted for murder back in Punjab. And the Canadians said no. Well, they didn't really have a proper extradition treaty with India. India didn't recognize the Queen as the head of state, which sounds crazy to say that, but it's relevant because the only extradition treaty in force was the Commonwealth. And because India didn't respect the Queen as Canada does, then it didn't apply. It's crazy. Don't get me started. It's a crazy business. But that doesn't tell you that Canada was complicit. Canada was blind and incompetent in its failure to stop the bombing. So, by the way, was Air India. And the Indian government, which owned Air India. Air India was sending around warnings all over the world to every airport authority saying, look, we're getting threats all the time. We believe that these Khalistanis are going to try to put bombs on planes. Make sure we get the best possible security. And they said that to Canada too. 3 weeks before the Air India bombing, they sent out a telex saying exactly that. And who let the bomb on the plane? Well, Air India loaded a bag which was unaccompanied. They loaded a suitcase with a bomb in it in Vancouver. The passenger who bought that ticket did not get on that plane in Vancouver. So that's a red flag, right? Then the plane goes to Toronto. They transfer this still unaccompanied bag. There's still no passenger traveling with it. They transfer it to Air India Flight 182. Who did that? Air India did it. So apparently, there's enough blame to go around. The Indian government and the Canadian government and many other governments were all naive at that time. But naivete is not the same thing as being complicit. Afterwards, there were failures of competence, the destruction of many of, not all, but many of the wiretap tapes, the failure to bring a prosecution, the failure really to understand what was happening, and the turf wars between security agencies, all of that, you can't excuse it. It's unforgivable. But complicity, no, I would not go that far. I think that to this day, what you have on the part of politicians, as we discussed earlier, is laziness. They see they see this guy coming saying, I can bring you 10,000 Sikh votes if you sing my song. And they say, okay, why not? Sure, I can use the 10,000 votes. And then I can say later, well, I didn't know. I didn't No, they were going to put up a poster of Tavinda Parmar as a martyr, and that's the present day. That's the problem why we still talk about it today, is because they still try to pretend that Parmar was a hero, a martyr of the Sikh nation, and that he was innocent, which is a lie. It's disinformation.
Okay, so then what do you think that Canada made a blunder to allow these terror activities on its soil?
Yes, absolutely. There's no question about it. And I think most Canadians know now, because of the 4 years of the criminal trial and the 4 years of the judicial inquiry, even if you are not paying attention, you've got that idea that, Canada was dumb, to put it no more strongly than that, to allow these activities to continue. I mean, consider that, even before the bombing, a friend of mine who used to be the High Commissioner of Canada in New Delhi was being called in by the Indian government.
Okay.
And after the assassination of Indira Gandhi by her son Rajiv Gandhi as Prime Minister, to be called on the carpet in no uncertain terms by the Indian government, saying, why is Canada allowing these people to run roughshod over the law in Canada? You have had violent demonstrations at the Indian consulate in Toronto. People have broken into the consulate, busted up the furniture, attacked people. You have had the Indian High Commissioner on a visit to Winnipeg, attacked in the street with sticks by a Khalistani mob. You have attacks on the Khalistan. You had a near attack on Ujjwal Assange, who as a young lawyer spoke against the violent tactics of the Khalistanis.
Okay.
And all of these signs should have been enough, but Canada did look the other way and paid a heavy price.
Okay. Since you bring the High Commission, actually, so let me ask you a different question. Since the issue of Khalistan activity inside Canada has taken a toll on its bilateral relationship between India and Canada, what do you think in way forward for the two countries to mend their ties?
Well, I think both countries need to get real. What I mean by that is that what perhaps the most notable example that you probably have in mind is the visit most recently of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to India, in which he called trouble. First with Captain Amarinder Singh and the Chief Minister, who accused Trudeau of having Khalistanis in his cabinet, and forced Trudeau to make a statement that he said, no, he supported the unity of India. And then he, with Captain Amarinder, who successfully extracted a price from Trudeau to get that meeting. And then, even more damaging to Trudeau was the fact that it emerged, it was a really ridiculous story in many ways, that a former convicted terrorist of the ISYF, the International Sikh Youth Federation, a banned illegal terrorist organization, turned out to be on the guest list, Canadian High Commissioner's guest list for the big diplomatic reception for Trudeau in New Delhi. What was he doing there? How did he get an invitation? Why was he on the list? And it turned out that his name is Jasper Atwal, it turned out that he had actually for some years been working his way into the good graces of the Liberal Party of Canada, then the federal governing party. And that people had again looked the other way. Oh, well, never mind his background. Or they pretended they didn't know about his background. Anyway, it was very, very embarrassing. Now, that made plain to everyone who could see the naivete that we spoke about earlier shown by Canada. And so there was every reason that people would be shocked and scandalized by that revelation, which resulted, of course, in the invitation to the Jasper Atwell being withdrawn. However, India, in the person, in that case of, let's look at Captain Amarinder Singh's complaints against Trudeau, that there were Khalistanis in his cabinet. Well, in truth, just because you have a turban doesn't mean you're a Khalistani.
Yeah.
Captain Amarinder made exactly the same mistake in reverse. He assumed without evidence that just because there were Sikhs in the cabinet and because they were Canadians, they were all Canadian Sikhs are Khalistanis. That's a serious error, because most obviously because it isn't true, but also it's very undiplomatic. I mean, and one of them, for example, is Haji Sajjan, the defense minister, whose father, yes, was a founding member of the World Sikh Organization, which is a separatist organization and was always intended to be one. It's in its constitution that it's a separatist organization. Well, you know, your father in the 1980s was a member, you know, I mean, is that some sort of crime? You're not allowed now to enter politics and be successful? Haji Sajjan denied, of course, that he had any such association. There has never been any evidence that I know of that he's said or done anything that could be called campaigning for an independent state for the Sikhs. But Captain Amarinder overstated the case, and I think damaged himself by overstating it. He had a legitimate complaint that there are Khalistanis who are tolerated by politicians in Canada. But that's not the same thing as saying that the Prime Minister himself is knowingly putting Khalistani supporters in the cabinet, because that wasn't true. I mean, if it is true, I know of no evidence, and I think I would know.
Okay. So, what do you think? Like, what is the percentage of the Sikhs living in Canada subscribing to the theory of Khalistan and the terrorism?
Well, I would say with great confidence that it's a minority.
Okay.
I would also say that it's a small minority, but then if you ask me to define small, I would fall silent, because I don't know the answer to that. It hasn't really been tested. I will tell you that there is only one Gurdwara in Canada that openly displays the martyr poster of Talwinder Parmar, pretending that he's a big hero, lying to their children that he is the martyr of the Sikh nation, that he is innocent, and this is nonsense. This is lies. It's wrong to tell children lies. It's a serious matter to show contempt for the independent, professional, and transparent justice system in Canada. That's wrong, to throw contempt upon that system, which transparently in public tested the evidence under oath in a long trial and a long judicial inquiry. But as I say, there is only one Gurdwara that goes that far, to put up a big poster, I mean, bigger than your TV screen, and put it up on the outside. You know, it's a thumb in the eye to the Canadian public, saying, we don't care what you think. We don't care that this guy is in fact a mass murderer of Canadians of Indian descent. We don't care. We're going to call him a martyr, so the hell with you. Now, that one Gurdwara, however, it certainly represents a very small minority of Canadian Sikhs. But it's not some backstreet Gurdwara. It's in the second largest city in British Columbia, which is an important province of Canada. And it draws very large crowds each year for its Vaisakhi Day parade. You know, they have in excess of 100,000 people out for that parade. Every year they come out, and in that parade they show the pictures of the martyrs and Sukha and Jinder and the great, basically Sikh assassins. With pictures of them holding AK-47s. They glorify the terrorist struggle. So even though they may be a very small minority, they're not insignificant. And they do apparently have some political influence, because many politicians, they sort of check to see if there are any TV cameras, and then they go to the parade.
Right, right. So my last question, if it has a little support, do you think the silence of the moderate majority of the Sikhs has been an adverse reason for the Khalistan movement to have a free run in Canada?
Yeah, I think sometimes I've become friends with many of the Air India victims' families over the years, because we've seen each other often, waiting for court to open, waiting for them to testify at the inquiry. And the people I've come to know quite well, and they have endured a great deal. And they asked me the question, another hard question, that's the third hard question you've asked, why are the Sikhs themselves so silent?
Okay.
Well, I can tell you two reasons.
Okay.
One, fear.
Okay.
And two, it's justified.
Okay.
Here's what I mean. The trial failed, angering the victims' families a great deal, to obtain convictions, except in the case of the bomb maker, Rayat, who spent most of the last 30 years in jail, and who confessed that he built the bombs for Parma. But the trial failed. Why? The witnesses were threatened with death. So those threats are still in force. I don't remember, I would know by now, if they had decided, look, it's all in the past, you're free to go. Nobody's going to have any reprisal against you if you tell the truth about what you heard. Remember that Tara Singh, the publisher of the Indo-Canadian Times in British Columbia, was first attacked and left in a wheelchair. He was shot once, and then finally in 1998 shot again and killed, because he was a witness. He heard a confession, he heard an account of how they got the bombs on the plane, and he told the police, and he was ready to testify. Well, he didn't testify. Right. So if you knew about this, would you testify? So there were quite a few people. There was a number of witnesses who decided the answer to that question was no. Some of them testified, look, I have two children. I'm not going to take the risk. And whatever I said before to that police officer, I don't remember any of that now. I'm not going to say anything. And that's one reason for the silence of Sikhs who are in the know. More generally, I think today that they are less silent. For example, the article which brought us together today, I've received a lot of messages and tweets from people saying, from Sikhs, saying, I'm a Sikh, and this whole story rings true to me, and I wish that these Khalistanis would just give up and shut up and go away. Right. But it used to be that they weren't so vocal, and there was a reason for that, because if they looked around and they asked themselves the question, does Canada care to protect me if I speak up and I'm threatened and beaten? Right. Because that happened a lot. And they, as I say, many of them answered that question, no, it's not worth it, because Canada will not protect me. Right. I think you're right on this one, because for some people, not majority of the Sikhs, like majority of the people don't even believe in this kind of whatever the radicalization is happening through these people. And also, this is a kind of business for some people. I'll give you one example. You can comment on that one. Sikhs for Justice, they have an office in Canada and they have an office in US. And Mr. Gurpatwant Singh Pannu, he the legal advisor to this one, outspoken. And he spoke recently in the favor of China. When there is a issue, definitely
there is many issue between the Canadian and the Chinese government, and also U.S. and the China government. And he is being a citizen of the both countries. I hope at least. I
Yes.
think it is. So, what do you think as a citizen, the people like him speaking in the favor of China and who are also doing the genocide of the people and who are violating the human rights, on top of these people are pretending they are the human rights, they are the protector of the human rights, and they are pretty much sleeping with the enemy.
I think you make a very good point. They are sleeping with the enemy. Pannu has made an absolute fool of himself, if you ask my opinion,
Uh-huh.
by openly siding with India's enemy in China, in the current border dispute, and with Pakistan, India's mortal enemy.
Right.
Writing to Imran Khan and saying, oh, well, if India ever attacks Pakistan, all the pro-Khalistani Sikhs will come to Pakistan's defense. I mean, firstly, it's absurd because his movement has no troops, it has no power, and it has no support in Punjab.
Right.
It has no support. It's ridiculous that you run up to a nuclear state and say, I will defend you. I don't think Imran Khan would be very impressed if you don't even have a gun.
Right.
So I think Pannu has made a fool of himself.
Right.
But it's also deeply contradictory when
Right.
you consider the record of Pakistan vis-a-vis the Sikhs.
Right.
I mean, there were a couple of million Sikhs
Right.
in what is now Pakistani Punjab.
Right.
Back in the day, at the
Right.
time of partition,
Right.
they were driven out. They were
Right.
massacred. They
Right.
are still being driven out to this day.
Right.
There is persecution, there are forced conversions, there are attacks on Gurdwaras,
Right.
and they're down to what is it, 8 or 10,000 Sikhs left from 2 million. So
Right.
while Pakistan is pushing out real Sikhs,
Right.
it is pretending to defend imaginary separatist Sikhs.
Right.
And giving, in practice, no victory to anyone but themselves. Pakistan wins its agenda, gets its agenda, making life difficult for India, but the Sikhs, the separatists, the Khalistanis, I mean, don't get anything for their agenda, which is an independent state. So for that reason, I think that it's obvious that most Sikhs understand this long before I did, and they're not interested in his referendum at all.
Referendum 2020. Mr. Terry.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Who's going to show up?
Right. Yeah, because even majority of the people actually, so now think actually he's making the fun of the Punjabi and the Sikhs, like the hardworking Sikhs. But on the other side actually, so you have a very good and the history working with the Sikh people. Majority of the Sikh people, very hardworking, loyal people. They are working hard, but these are the small portion. Few of these people actually, so they come over here and they try to take a shortcut actually, so try to make a money and set up these kind of movement as a business. So that's where looks like the problem is.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. There does seem to be money in it. There does seem to be some profit. I mean, one of Parmar's closest associates during the time when he was plotting the bombing of Air India,
right,
is a very wealthy man to this day, Gurpatwant Singh Malik. He went on trial and he was acquitted, but he was a prominent financier of the Baba Khalsa and of Parmar's operation, and he made a lot of money. Selling rebellion, and trinkets, and making himself the place to go to buy things to stand up against the terrible government of India. I have noticed, it's impossible not to notice, that some of the most noisy Khalistanis, not just in Canada but around the world, seem to be driving very nice cars.
Yes, yes, that's true. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. Before we conclude, you can also conclude. What do you think about the referendum 2020, which is happening especially in Canada and US and some the other part of the world? What is your personal feeling, since you have a lot of history, about the Khalistan 2020 activity?
I think that it may give the Khalistanis a rude shock that they have been wise to avoid for many years, for so long, for decades now, since the early 1980s.
Okay.
They've been telling us that they are the authentic representatives, the authentic voice of the Sikhs. All the Sikhs. We speak for all the Sikhs.
Uh-huh.
And they've drowned out many or beaten many Sikhs who say, no, you don't speak for me.
Right.
What I think may happen now is that they've made a strategic blunder by entering into this referendum, because it's going to give the lie to that claim. Take Canada, for example, with 500,000 Sikhs. Let's imagine that they have a big success with the referendum, and 100,000 Sikhs come out to vote.
Okay.
100,000. That would be impressive. It's not a real public election. There's very little publicity for it, except what they can organize themselves. It would be an achievement. You try to get 100,000 people out. It's not easy.
Right.
But even if they succeeded in doing that, think about it. That leaves 80% of Canadian Sikhs who showed no interest.
Right.
Didn't even bother. Right. They don't care about the whole referendum thing. So, to say nothing of the 90% of all the world's Sikhs who live in India, in Punjab.
Uh-huh.
So I think that they may get a nasty surprise, and that it may bring the Khalistani movement to the end of the road, when the basic lie that they've been telling us for these many years, that they speak for the Sikhs, is exposed by their own hand as being false.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Terry. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. And so we will stay in touch, and maybe looking forward to talk to you in near future again.
I enjoyed it very much talking to you, even though you asked hard questions.
Thank you. Thank you.